But don't worry, I won't be getting down into any detail or legal technicalities, partly because I would be lost down there. I want to talk about regulation in the broad, about what it means for public policy professionals like us who are in the solutions business, and what it means for the economy. Before I jump into that, a little bit about me. I lead a small team in New South Wales Treasury that focuses on regulatory policy, and I'll expand on that shortly. My background, I've worked for more than 30 years in government, in public policy, nearly always in economic policy roles, always in a Treasury, beginning with the Commonwealth and now with the New South Wales Treasury. I've worked in ministerial offices at the federal level, and for a short while, I was a diplomat based in London. Now, at different points during this time, I did think about whether there might be some other jobs out there for me, but I always seem to come back to this. For me, public policy is endlessly fascinating and frustrating in equal measures. Problems never go away. The challenges don't get any smaller. And I seem to be drawn to that like a moth to a flame. I want to spend a moment now just explaining Treasury's role in regulation, because we're not really a regulator. And so you may be wondering why I'm here talking about regulation. And I've been around long enough not to be offended or surprised that some may think that Treasury's role starts and stops with the budget. Virtually the computer says no to every request. You with a more nuanced view of our role. So, as Louisa alluded to at the beginning, regulation is one of government's primary levers to influence the behaviour of individuals and organisations. Government uses it to confer economic, social and community benefits, to regulate against certain business practices that harm consumer interests, to prohibit undesirable behaviours such as crime, to encourage better health outcomes for individuals and society, and to achieve better environmental outcomes. You no doubt have all experienced some pretty ordinary examples of regulation in your own agencies, and perhaps you've even been asked to create some of them. But every agency has an interest in good regulation. You have a stock of regulation you are responsible for, and good regulation helps you achieve your ultimate objectives. Treasury's interest comes through the strong ties that regulation has to the economy. We have two core areas of focus. The obvious one is managing finances. And I must confess that in my 30 years in Treasury departments, I have largely succeeded in avoiding having much to do with the budget. The other focus is the relevant one for this discussion and where I've spent all my time, and that is with policy and advice on how to achieve an efficient allocation of resources. Regulation has direct impacts on citizens, consumers, workers, and businesses. It influences choices we all make about how we manufacture, how much we consume, where we locate, and so on. So you can see it is all relevant to resource allocation. Done poorly, it can impose a significant burden on us all through excessive time taken in compliance, additional costs in a production process, excessive damage done to individuals' health or to the health of the environment. Now, there are a wide range of estimates about this cost of regulation, and they inevitably involve judgments about what is an appropriate level of regulation and what's excessive. Now, research has shown these estimates can range up to $87 billion in annual compliance costs. And that's not to say you can save $87 billion annually, because much of this regulation is probably the essential regulation that nobody would propose removing. But even taking a conservative assumption that you can shave just 5% off that cost by removing unnecessary or badly designed regulation, you're talking about savings of around $4 billion annually. Now that's around 1/4 of the education budget, or a quarter of the WestConnex project, or a CBD light rail. So it's significant. So apart from the impact regulation has on achieving policy objectives, you can see that it can have significant effects on the economy, which gives added importance for a treasury. Now, I've put this slide up in the hope that it would help illustrate how our involvement in the regulatory process fits in with a number of other frameworks. Let's go through sorry, I've just lost all my slide. Proposals go through can go through any number of different channels as part of the assessment process, but all with the same objective of a fully informed cabinet decision. And regulation is no different. Our role is to try and ensure that the process by which regulations are developed and assessed will result in the highest quality of regulation, delivering the greatest net benefits to the community. I don't have a slide. Sorry, Nathan, if you want to move on to the next slide. Oh no, they seem to be out of order. There are a number of frameworks and guidelines sitting in my division. Might be the slide before that, Nathan. Yep, that's it. So that slide just illustrates how there are a range of different channels that proposals will go through for an evaluation, one of which is regulation. Now, on this slide, but sitting within our division, there are a number of other sort of guidelines and frameworks that we administer that are relevant to each of these processes. The cost-benefit analysis framework is probably the most recognisable, particularly associated with large infrastructure projects, so you might be more familiar with that. There are guidelines on user charging. There are program evaluation guidelines. And then there is the Guide to Better Regulation policy, which is shown on here, and that's the guide that my team is responsible for now. When I think of the regulatory system, I think of it in terms of ups and flows. In Treasury, we engage the flow of regulatory proposals at the front end to help Cabinet be as fully informed as possible. And this is where the Guide to Better Regulation sits. And we look at the existing stock of regulation as something to be investigated for potential reform. Technology has a role to play with both the flow and the stock of regulation. Now, in the past, governments have tried to improve the stock of regulation using mechanistic rules, such as one-on, two-off rules, where if you want to bring in a new regulation, you have to find two that you can repeal. Now, these rules were intended to guard against a tendency to accumulate more and more regulation, which adds to the cost burden. But we found that we basically wrung whatever value we can get out of those mechanistic approaches. They achieved some benefit when they were first introduced, but their value has largely disappeared. We need to move on to something that can deliver sustainable benefits, where the owners of a regulation manage it as they would any other asset, deciding when regulations need reviewing so that they can remain fit for purpose. Agencies have every incentive to maintain them so they can continue to deliver the benefits they were intended to provide to the community. I'm talking about the concept of regulatory stewardship. Now, some of you may already be familiar with it. It's been applied in New Zealand and Canada for several years. It's not without its risks, because some find comfort in prescription. But I think we need to make this change, because we've seen that what we have now is largely not working. The public debate is frequently littered with references to deregulation, which is often code for less regulation. And sometimes less regulation is the right answer, because times have moved on, risks have changed, or there are alternative ways of managing those risks. Just think of the technology at play now with ride sharing. And if regulation is not actually being effective in addressing the problem it was intended for, then we should remove it. But we need to find a better solution. So we really need to shift the public debate to be about effective regulation. We need to recognise that sometimes effective regulation will require more regulation. If something is not being regulated effectively now, and we are not capturing the true costs and benefits to society, short-term and long-term, for all people, then there is a misallocation of resources. Stewardship is a simple concept. It just involves agencies scanning their regulatory landscape on a regular basis to identify where the need for change is greatest and where the benefits from change will be greatest. Of course, this has been done in the past and can be done the old-fashioned way with people like us slogging our way through the statute books. Or we could consider whether the task would be faster and less painful by using AI software to map the landscape and give us some data to help shape that regulatory reform task. Some of you today may already have your own experience with AI software, in which case we would love to hear about it. Which brings me to the research and discussion paper we'll be publishing in a few weeks' time. We've taken a high-level look at all regulation in New South Wales using this AI software to see what sort of information it could produce, what questions it raises, and to think about how this technology might best be utilised. So the work is really a work in progress. We're still digesting the information, and we'll think about where to take this next. We've worked with Deloitte using their software package called Reg Explorer. There are others, and we're not claiming that this is the only or necessarily the best software option. It trawled through all regulations on the New South Wales legislation database and identified certain characteristics. So the first finding I'll share with you is on the volume of regulation, whereas the software counted, it's the sections in regulation. And this chart shows the volume of sections in the by decade that they were created. As you can see, the number of sections doubled in the 9 years to 2019 compared to the previous decade, which I find quite an extraordinary change. I suspect we would have all expected an increase, but a doubling is quite notable. It turns out that this trend is consistent with the trends seen in the United States and the European Union at the same period. So what does it mean? We can probably all think of reasons why the trend in regulation has been an upward trend. Since the 1980s, we've seen new markets, products and services emerge. Regulation has helped provide a framework to enable these markets to grow. to implement minimum standards, and to create a level playing field for participants by avoiding market power, corruption, and insider trading. Regulators have also provided society with additional protections by enforcing rights such as privacy, legislating to protect the environment, protecting employees from discrimination, and customers from new threats that require a greater focus on cybersecurity. We've seen greater movement to harmonisation of rules across borders to enable goods and services and people to flow across those borders. The exponential improvements in IT capacity may perhaps have made it almost too easy to produce regulations. And of course, there is the question of how much governments regulate first instincts may have contributed to this increased volume. So answering this sort of question is where I think that AI software can help. I'd rather have it do the legwork and leave me free to think of the questions we want it to ask. I like the idea of being able to slice and dice the database without necessarily knowing that I have the right question to begin with. But I wouldn't be that cavalier if I was asking someone in my team to do that work without the help of this technology. I don't want to focus too long on this set of numbers, because on the face of it, it's impossible to know whether these numbers are indicative of something good or bad. There are 88,000 sections of New South Wales regulation. And the previous slide showed how that was a doubling. The average age of a regulation is 22 years. 6,000 sections have not been touched since they were created. Almost 4,000 sections have only been edited once. And 4,000 sections have not been edited for 10 years. So while I don't know what to make of these numbers just yet, I'm curious to find out. I would like some comparative data from other jurisdictions, the Commonwealth and the other states in Australia for starters, to help benchmark these numbers. Unfortunately, the Reg Explorer software package doesn't have that data included yet. They're basically building, beginning with New South Wales. They're adding the Commonwealth data at the moment, and then they hope to follow with other Australian jurisdictions. But if 4,000 sections of regulation have not been edited for 10 years, what does that mean? Which regulations are they? In which portfolios? Does it suggest neglect? Or does it reflect the nature of what they are regulating and that it hasn't needed to change? I can imagine that in justice, there are many provisions dealing with definitions of crimes that haven't needed to change in many years and don't need to. Similarly, with the 22 years average age of regulation, what does that mean? This could reflect that what is being regulated has long needed regulation. For example, we've always regulated the sale of goods, conveyancing, taxation, and these regulations will be amended periodically, but they are quite old. But it could also mean there are regulations that are no longer relevant, but nobody's got around to removing them. They may be doing no harm, but how do we know without checking? Now, this is my favourite example to illustrate this point. It's an example from the United States, where a man this year tried to use a very old regulation to settle a custody dispute through a trial by combat. As he said, to this day, trial by combat has never been explicitly banned or restricted as a right in the United States, adding that it was used as recently as 1818 in British court. And then staying on script, He asked the judge for a 12-week delay so he could set about securing some Japanese samurai swords, and then suggested that his ex-wife's lawyer could be her champion in the duel. So here in New South Wales, you can find plenty of examples of regulations that have stayed on the statute books way past the use by. There's just one example here of the Innkeepers Act of 1968, which was repealed last year. And when you looked at it, it imposed a liability of $100 on innkeepers if anything untoward happened to any of their guests' horses, their harnesses, or any other livestock they may have brought with them to the inn. And then there are the regulations you wonder at, how they made their way onto the statute books in the first place. The Road Rules Regulation of 2014 seeks to protect us all from being splashed with mud while waiting at a bus stop. Now, maybe I'm doing an injustice to this one. Perhaps there are some serious health issues that arise from being splashed with mud, of which I am completely unaware. Now, on a related theme, the research revealed how much of our regulation is still requiring compliance activities that can be considered outdated. The government acknowledged this by relaxing some legal and administrative requirements at the start of the COVID pandemic. It permitted activities to be undertaken digitally, such as document display requirements, compulsory meetings, and the signing and witnessing of documents, where previously they required a physical presence. As you can see from the numbers in this slide, there are still 350 sections in New South Wales law referencing the use of facsimile. 81 mentions in sections that require a notice to be published in a newspaper. 76 sections still referencing a telegram. 10 referencing microfiche. It must be almost 40 years since I've had cause to reference microfiche. Now, I don't know how much of this represents a material impact on today's activities, but it is suggestive of a stock of requirements that are outdated and could be listed for improvement whenever an agency was going to make some legislative changes. I would suggest this could be simply woven into the fabric of an agency's regulatory stewardship work program. The next theme I want to touch on is that of how regulation copes with technology, particularly how it can support innovation. The Red Flag Act of 1865 from the UK is quite a well-known regulation. And it's easy to laugh now at the regulatory approach in 1865 to the emergence of automobiles. But they did what they thought was appropriate at the time to manage the risks they saw associated with this new mode of transport. The primary aim of the law was to warn people about the loud noises produced by the vehicles. And they did that by requiring a man to proceed a horseless carriage on foot, carrying a red flag by day and a lantern by night. So clearly this was very prescriptive. And as it basically slowed the vehicle to walking speed, it removed its advantages. But it had the effect of discouraging the take-up of automobiles for a number of decades. There are many examples where prescriptive regulation is necessary to give confidence and certainty about what is required, where the risks are too great to leave to individuals to interpret how they might achieve the outcomes. For example, we don't leave it to individuals to choose which side of the road they drive on. We want certainty around food standards and building fire safety standards. The AI software searched all regulations for instances of prescriptive language. For example, where a regulation says shall, must, cannot, ought, and found that 37% of all sections in New South Wales regulation contain prescriptive language. So the challenge for regulators is to find a balance between prescription where it is needed and being outcomes focused to support innovation. When I think about technological change and regulation, the example I always go to is transport, so I'll stick with this theme. We can find examples in all other areas of life, but for me, it's easy to picture the change we can see in front of us every day. We're all familiar with the advent of Uber changing how we engage with passenger transport services, the emergence of personal mobility devices, motorised cycles, e-scooters, segways, motorised skateboards, and with the progress being made towards fully autonomous vehicles. I could throw in the regulation of drones, being aviation, and something we cover in our green paper later in July. But I will stick for now to the roads and footpaths. So the form of transport services is constantly changing. The risks have changed. The government has to keep pace, or ideally, get ahead of the game if we are to support innovation while protecting pedestrians and motorists. That is, we need to regulate in a way that is not dependent on the technologies of today, but focus on the outcomes we're striving to protect. The New South Wales government did this with the point-to-point transport reforms in 2015-16, recognising how Uber and others were changing the market. A whole bunch of prescriptive requirements, unnecessary requirements, were stripped away, such as requirements that stipulated what a taxi driver could wear, how far away they could move from their car while parked at a rank, the dimensions of their car, which basically dictated the make and model of the car they could purchase. And in their place, the new requirements concentrated on the all-important safety of passengers and drivers. Government recognised that technology was allowing passengers a convenient way of accessing a service at lower prices, while also having sufficient information to make their own judgments around safety. This to me is a great example of regulatory reform, recognising how the world has changed, is changing, how consumer preferences have changed, and that government's role as a regulator is constantly changing. The research we did using the AI software revealed that when we looked at driving regulations in New South Wales, we found there are 1,334 sections that reference the term driver and over 1,000 sections that reference the term passenger. Now, this makes complete sense in how we understand cars today. The distinction is going to be revolutionised by autonomous vehicles. Really driving the car. Who is responsible and will be held accountable in the event of an accident? Is the person sitting in what was the driver's seat? Is it the car manufacturer, designer of the autonomous car software? Regulations and insurance policies will need to be completely overhauled to reflect the different role we will be playing in relation to autonomous vehicles. Now, New South Wales law also refers to mobile phone use when driving to address safety concerns around the driver's concentration on the job at hand. But there are no references to the use of smartwatches. I think this illustrates the ongoing challenges for regulators to find the balance between prescription and being outcomes focused, given the speed with which technology is changing the environment. Our research found that there can be significant interactions between different regulations, highlighting one challenge for regulators to be aware of potential impacts or conflicts with other regulations. This one example an extract from the regulatory system of the Passenger Transport Regulation 2017 shows there are 489 citations relating to this regulation. So this includes upstream regulations, the regulations that the Transport Regulation cites, and they're referred to as the parent or grandparent regulations. And then there are the downstream regulations, ones that cite the Transport Regulation, known as the children or grandchildren. This sort of information supports the argument for regulatory stewardship to take a holistic approach, to look at an entire regulatory ecosystem rather than a piecemeal focus on individual regulations. Software can also find regulatory overlap, where businesses, for example, have to deal with more than one regulator and comply with many regulations. For example, there are 74 sections across 14 ministries referencing a restaurant and 29 sections across 10 ministries referencing a cafe. Now, perhaps there are good reasons for this. Perhaps it identifies potential reforms to streamline the regulatory experience for those being regulated. It can also help us identify where the volume of regulation is greatest by industry, so we can evaluate whether this is appropriate or not. The research showed that construction and mining were the two industry sectors referenced in the largest number of sections in New South Wales regulation, which was not a surprise to me. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. I hope you found some of it interesting. It's been a snapshot of what we in Treasury do and think about when it comes to regulation. If you are interested in any of this, I'll plug yet again that we have 2 papers coming out over the next month, so keep an eye out. If you take away some key messages from today, I hope they would be that, 1, regulation has significant impacts on the economy. So even marginal improvements can have major economic benefits. Remember, a 5% improvement could be like a boost of about $4 billion to the state economy. And because of these strong ties into the economy, regulatory reform can play its part in helping lift the economy out of the recession we're in now. And this will be very much part of the debate in the recovery phase of work in the coming months. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought regulation into a sharper focus, with the relaxation of numerous regulations to permit or support various activities. That presents us with the opportunity to pursue permanent regulatory reform. Regulation needs to adapt to be more technology neutral to support innovation, focusing on the outcomes rather than on the inputs. Now, there are numerous ways in which technology is being used to make compliance easier, which I haven't touched on today, such as the work that DCS is doing looking at converting regulations into digital code to allow it to be machine read, and developing virtual assistants and apps powered by digital rules to help business and citizens navigate complex regulatory requirements. The research paper I've highlighted today shows us one possible use for technology to identify opportunities to reduce burden and undertake regulatory reform. It's a tool to help us, not replace us, at least not this generation of robot. Which brings me to the end of my talk today. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this forum. I look forward to joining the upcoming seminars, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, either now or as a follow-up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott. That was a really interesting talk. I'm particularly fascinated about the use of artificial intelligence in policy making. So it's really good to see how it might work in practice, at least to kind of get some sense of the current state of play in terms of regulation. If the audience members would like to ask a question right now, feel free to pop it in the chat with all section. If you open your chat bubble, you'll should be able to see questions being asked. I know we've got at least one there. I'm going to, I'll get to that one in a minute while you're thinking of the questions that you might have for Scott. And I just wanted to ask a more general question, Scott, about what prompted you to undertake this research? What was the kind of, what were the steps or the events which led to the need for doing this?
So as part of our work on regulatory reform, which will be sort of covered in the green paper in late July, the conversation was very much about how can you set up the economy for the future to be as supportive of innovation and not impeding businesses coming up with different business models. And so we were thinking about, so what do we need to change? What do we need to think about? And we can, as analysts, be well aware of sort of big issues in particular sectors. So they sort of jump off the page. You've got to think about that, maybe do something about that in the future. But what we wanted to do was think about I guess, a more modern way of scanning the environment to see, well, what else have we missed? And a lot of the feedback you get from particularly business stakeholders is about frustration with their compliance experience. And so it comes back to the regulatory burden. You're asking me to have to go and appear in person and physically present this document or comply in ways which just don't really fit today, and it takes out time, and that is cost. So are there some tools, some software that would help us basically paint that picture of the current environment to see, well, where are all the sort of messy things that could be sort of tidied up without any great problem? Well, okay, let's sort of work that into a work plan that agencies can just sort of chip away at over time. But then hopefully also identify where there are the more significant barriers, where there might be some inadvertent definition in regulation, which is impeding business with a new model. And I guess I come back to that sort of the Uber example of 2015, where the regulation was very much of its time. Looking back at how we all knew and experienced those transport services then technology came in, changed the game, and because Uber had deep pockets, they basically decided just to push ahead with the model in spite of the existing regulatory requirements. But it did then highlight that, well, are there some language and even unintended barriers that are there in place and frustrating either business or consumers that can be tidied up. But anyway, long-winded answer to say it's very much about sort of being in the bushes to see where the problems are, where the big and the small ones are, and then you come up with a plan for how you'll deal with it. So as a steward, you might look at, all right, we've got a bunch of things there we could fix. These are the big ones. All right, let's target those, give them a priority. These are sort of weird that they're still on the statute books, but they're probably not having any impact on people's lives in any material way. We'll tidy them up in a convenient way at the appropriate time. So it was part of our forward-looking focus on regulatory reform.
Great. It's good to know the background. I think in doing our work, we often don't pay enough attention to that when we talk about it. So it's always good to understand the context. I can see we've got one question, and I'm going to answer this one. The question. I'm not quite sure who it's come from, but it says we talk about policy instruments, and it's understood that regulation is one such policy instrument. What are the other examples? I guess what are the alternatives? I'm going to give a quick answer, and then I might hand over to Scott to see if he has any thoughts about the other instruments that could be used as an alternative to regulation. There's quite a spectrum of different policy instruments, and it ranges really from government doing the activity itself, so a direct action. It's like government builds a bridge, government buys land, government does something that's within its power to do an activity. What I call that direct action. And then there's other things. So there's education, so education campaigns. There can be assessment processes, a type of regulation where you require someone to go through some sort of assessment process. There can be governance type instruments. Let's set up this body, this organisation to address this issue. There can be guidelines, incentives, land reservation, levies, programs. Programs are probably one of the important ones where there are prescribed arrangements, often involving external parties, requires those participants to undertake actions resulting in practical outcomes. There can also be schemes, market-based instruments, strategies, which are really a plan to achieve a stated goal, usually drawing in multiple components or aspects to focus attention on an issue. And another type of instrument is a target, where there's a fixed goal or objective described in a measurable way, could include benchmarking or performance indicators as well. So that gives you a sense of the kind of the broad range of different types of policy instruments. But I wanted to ask Scott a kind of a follow-up question about whether there were any observations that he has found through doing this research or otherwise about, if we're not doing regulation, what are the alternatives that we should be looking for in terms of policy instruments?
So that hasn't really been a part of this work that we've done with Deloitte, because it was very much just using at a higher level some software to, so counting, the incidence of prescriptive language, or the number of regulations, or measuring the age of things, so that didn't go into anything in a qualitative sense. So I think you covered the landscape very well, Louisa, about the different ways in which government seeks to influence behaviours and outcomes. So I don't want to sort of canvas that. I'd say on as part of our the sort of better regulation guidelines, the guidelines are saying to an agency that when you're clear of it, that there is a problem for government, the government can do something about and should do something about, that regulation may be an option. There should be non-regulatory options considered, just to ensure that we don't fall into that trap of only regulation. It's regulate first and forget about anything else. Because there are other models where you have that there'll still be some form of regulation, but it might be industry self-regulation, or it's an arrangement that has been designed in cooperation between government and industry. So there are different levels of prescription. I think there are plenty of examples out there where industry themselves have come up with codes of practice to influence the behaviour of their members, and those codes of practice have basically been given the seal of approval by government, but it's developed by industry and it's policed by industry. So they're regulation, but it's not the capital R regulation that we probably all think of. But certainly from a Treasury perspective, we are always keen to explore the non-regulatory options, because it is very hard. I heard Rod Sims from the ACCC a few weeks ago had a line which I loved, which he said, you can't regulate for innovation. And he was basically saying that sort of no matter how clever we are, we're probably going to end up tripping up and putting in place a barrier to innovation if we think that the answer to dealing with this problem is regulation. So, you know, from an economist's point of view, from a Treasury point of view, we might look at, are there market solutions that would achieve the outcomes? So can we, rather than just settling for a monopoly and regulating every aspect of life under that monopoly, is there a way of getting more competition into that market and allow the market forces through competition to provide the disciplines that drive the outcomes that consumers ultimately want? Not sure what more I can say about that, Louisa.
It's good, I think, to start the conversation to at least even think about what are the alternatives. I think that is probably, you know, the first step. How can you achieve the objectives or the, you know, address the problem that you're presented with through thinking all the options. You can start with the no, just don't do it. We'll put that into legislation, and through to the different ways of working with stakeholders, understanding the context, thinking about programs. You know, can we pay you not to do it, for example? I guess is a thing that has been proposed for some to address some issues. I wanted to finish up with one more question. I know we're over time, but we did start a bit late, so I'm taking a little bit more of your time. But I wanted to kind of draw it back to some takeaways in terms of how could agencies use this sort of software to help with their regulatory design, or how could they use the concept of regulatory stewardship in their own work?
So I think in some ways, I mean, the work we've done with Deloitte on this paper for us is us sort of dipping our toe in the water to get a better familiarity with the software to see how useful it might be, because the longer term game, I think, is around regulatory stewardship and how agencies might best be able to perform that function. And you can do it without technology, but I think that from what I've seen, that I could envisage an agency having access to this software and then being able to frame some very specific questions to around just their portfolio to get to a deeper level of understanding beyond the ones that we showed today, which was just counting, you know, the number and the age and so on. But to know, well, if you've got some old regulations, or you've got some regulations with prescriptive language in there, let's interrogate that to see, maybe it's there for a very good reason, and maybe it's been there for 10 years for a very good reason. And one of the thoughts we have is that we might have a second bit of work with this, where this has really been painting a broad landscape And next, it'd be interesting to maybe work with one or two agencies and then just sort of drill down to say, all right, look, I mean, we could pick DCS being a very large regulator or transport and say, let's work with you, use this software to help you understand what the sort of, if you're doing a health check on your stock of regulation asset, what does it look like? I mean, I'd see that as being, on an ongoing basis. You might do sort of a deep dive now, you might do it sort of periodically, but over time, it'd be the sort of database that would just help you tap in and just check that if you've taken an eye off some things, you might have been focusing on where the main game was and where you thought the biggest risks and the benefits were. But can this tool help you just keep an eye that you haven't let things drift? There might be some easy things that could be done as long as you still know them. So I see it very much as potentially a very useful tool for agencies to keep abreast of their regulations. And if they're doing a bit of work, it's like the example with that transport regulation. You look at all the other regulations that might be affected by you changing something in one regulation. If you wanted to do something to update things for autonomous vehicles, you'd want to know that that work was being done sort of most effectively and efficiently, and that rather than just focusing on one regulation, you look at the possible flow-on consequences for any other. So that part of sort of the whole being a regulatory steward is not only sort of managing it over time, but thinking about a whole regulatory system, not just specific regulations. I think I could see it being quite useful in that regard.
I think you're going to get some uptake there of people saying, "Will you please look at my set of regulations to see? We want to know. We want a health check on our set of regulations." So I hope you're ready for a few knocks on the door. So we'll finish up there. I wanted to thank you, Scott, for coming along today and presenting this new and innovative piece of research and giving us some thoughts to start our journey in developing, I guess, better regulation. And I just also wanted to thank people behind the scenes, Nathan, Stephanie, and Josh from the PSC. Thank you very much for supporting the webinar today. And I look forward to seeing some of you in the next webinar that we have coming up, which is with the new head of Resilience New South Wales, and hearing about how and his name is, Shane Fitzsimmons, I should have mentioned, ex-head of RFS. You probably got to know him a little bit over the summer, unfortunately. But he's going to be talking about the interface between policy and operations during the bushfire emergency and the lessons learned. So that's an exciting one coming up on the 23rd of July. So thank you very much all, and we'll endeavour to get back with the question to you with answers on the questions we didn't get to today. Thank you all, and goodbye. Have a good day.